They say history doesn't repeat, but it does echo, and sometimes the echo is louder than the original. On April 5th, 1933, inside the Oval Office, thick with cigarette smoke and panic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed a piece of paper that would quietly rearrange the wealth of an entire nation. It was called Executive Order 6102, a simple order code, just numbers and ink, but behind it was something far more profound. The legal power to criminalize one of humanity's oldest stores of value. Within 30 days, every American had to hand over their gold. Coins, bullion, certificates, everything. If they refused, a $10,000 fine, the equivalent of $250,000 today, and up to 10 years in prison. 10 years. For owning the same metal that had backed the US dollar since the Civil War. And yet, Americans complied. Not because they were weak, but because they believed. Because in the depths of the Great Depression, trust in government still felt like a survival instinct. They lined up inside banks, their pockets heavy with coins that their grandparents had buried for security. They placed their gold bars onto marble counters, believing what Roosevelt promised. This is temporary. This is patriotic. This is how we save the country. The government paid them $20.67 per ounce, the official price fixed since 1879. Then, 9 months later, Roosevelt revealed the second half of his plan. He revalued gold to $35 per ounce, a 69% overnight increase. In a single stroke, the U.S. government created billions in new value, not through innovation, not through industrial growth, but by simply changing a number. Americans lost around 40% of their wealth instantly, and the worst part? They couldn't even buy back what they once owned. Gold ownership was now a crime, and would be for 41 years. People today hear this story and assume it happened in a distant primitive era. But the truth is far more unsettling. This was the blueprint, a blueprint so effective, so quiet, and so powerful that it has never been forgotten by those who run governments, central banks, and treasury departments. And now in 2025, that blueprint has been pulled back off the shelf. But this time, the target is not gold. It's something far more traceable, far more liquid, far more controlled by digital infrastructure than physical vaults. Bitcoin. On January 23, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order establishing something called the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. The language was familiar, uncomfortably familiar. Strategic asset, national security, Treasury Acquisition Authority, to be mandatory mechanisms. These were not phrases about innovation, not about fostering a digital-first economy. These were the same phrases Roosevelt used in 1933, nearly word for word. History wasn't just echoing, it was repeating. The order framed Bitcoin as a critical national security asset, granting the Treasury-wide authority to acquire and hold it. It positioned digital assets as essential to American financial leadership, a phrase that sounds optimistic, but in geopolitical language, it is a warning. This wasn't the start of a technology revolution. This was the start of a legal framework for confiscation, because America today faces a crisis far worse than 1933. Back then, national debt was 40% of GDP. Today, 132%. Interest payments alone now swallow more money than Medicare or defense spending. Every year, the U.S. must borrow more just to make interest payments on what it already owes. Mathematically, it cannot tax its way out. It cannot grow its way out. It cannot cut enough spending to escape the spiral. There is only one option left. The same option Roosevelt used. Confiscation plus revaluation, seizure, silent debt cancellation. What worked in 1933 could work again in 2025. But this time, the government isn't limited by the physical world. They don't need detectives searching basements for hidden gold bars. They don't need citizens to confess how many coins they stored under their floorboards. Blockchain is public. KYC records are permanent. Coinbase, Kraken, Gemini, they all already reported your identity to the IRS. Gold was anonymous. Bitcoin is not. And power loves transparency when the transparency benefits them. Most Americans in 1933 believed the government was rescuing them. Most today believe their digital assets are safe because they're decentralized. But decentralization protects the network. It doesn't protect the owner. To understand how dangerous the 2025 executive order is, we must revisit why Roosevelt confiscated gold. Because every modern debt crisis follows the same psychological curve: denial, fear, emergency powers, and finally forced wealth extraction. In 1933, America was collapsing. Unemployment, 25%. Thousands of banks failing. The dollar chained to the gold standard, unable to expand. People demanded gold withdrawals because they no longer trusted banks. This drained the Federal Reserve's reserves. If the gold ran out, the U.S. banking system would implode. Roosevelt didn't just confiscate gold. He confiscated the limiting mechanism that prevented money printing. The moment the gold was transferred into federal hands, the government gained the freedom to expand the money supply again. Deflation stopped. Liquidity returned. But every dollar Americans held was suddenly worth less. It was a rescue, but one paid for entirely by the citizens. This is the part that textbooks sanitize. In moments of national crisis, governments don't ask politely. They take. And the pattern always begins with legal language about national security. Just like 2025. Because when a government declares something a national security asset, they can justify anything: emergency acquisition, wartime powers, mandatory surrender, criminal penalties. Executive Order 6102 wasn't a one-time event. It was a template. And that template has been updated for the digital age. Today, America isn't facing a depression yet, but it is facing an unpayable mountain of debt, a weakening dollar, a fracturing global monetary order, and record levels of foreign central banks buying gold. In 1933, the government feared losing gold. In 2025, it fears losing control. The people who read history too casually think confiscation is unthinkable. The people who study history deeply understand it's inevitable when a monetary system reaches its breaking point. And right now, the breaking point is no longer decades away. It's on the calendar. We are not watching an innovation policy unfold. We are watching the first phase of a confiscation cycle. The same mechanism, the same justification, the same math, the same desperation. But the consequences will be far greater this time, because digital surveillance gives the government far more power than it had in 1933. And this is only the beginning, because what happens next will determine who loses everything and who escapes. To understand what's unfolding in 2025, you must understand the full machinery behind confiscation. Not the headlines, not the legal jargon, but the mechanism, the four-phase cycle that governments deploy when the walls begin to close in. It began in 1933 as a crude analog operation. It reappears today as a seamless digital strategy. Let's break it down. Phase 1, the legal framework, the quiet phase, the phase nobody pays attention to. In 1933, Executive Order 6102 was only the first move. Americans didn't understand the implications. They saw a temporary emergency measure, but Washington saw it differently: a legal doorway to a larger reconfiguration of the monetary system. The same thing has happened in 2025. Trump's strategic Bitcoin reserve order does not mention confiscation. Neither did Roosevelt's original order. That's the beauty and danger of legal scaffolding. It's built for future actions, not immediate ones. Both executive orders share the same DNA: declaring an asset strategic, tying it to national security, giving the Treasury Acquisition Authority, normalizing direct federal ownership, opening the pathway for compulsory acquisition. When you see these keywords together, it means only one thing: the government is placing a claim on the asset class. And once they place a claim, ownership becomes conditional. Gold stopped being a private savings tool in 1933. Bitcoin in 2025 is now being framed the same way. Not a citizen's asset, but a national resource. Whenever a government invokes national security, the door to confiscation opens automatically. The public rarely notices, but lawyers, central bankers, and historians do. This is why Phase 1 is the most dangerous. It feels harmless, and that's exactly why it works. Phase 2, voluntary acquisition. The "we're not confiscating, we're just accumulating" phase. This phase always begins gently. In 1933, the government didn't immediately revalue gold. They simply asked Americans to hand it in. The language was calm: patriotic, temporary. Most people complied because fear and hope coexisted. What does this phase look like in 2025? It looks like 1. Seizures from criminal cases. The U.S. already holds over 200,000 Bitcoin from Silk Road, ransomware takedowns, and darknet prosecutions. These are officially temporary holdings, but in reality they are becoming foundational reserves. 2. Accepting Bitcoin for taxes and federal fees. This is framed as convenience, but historically, when a government accepts something as payment, it's preparing to treat it as a sovereign asset. 3. Mining Bitcoin through government-owned energy infrastructure, hydroelectric dams, nuclear facilities, federal energy grids. The U.S. government can mine BTC at a cost approaching zero. This is the modern version of melting down confiscated gold, turning hard assets into state-controlled supply. 4. Surveillance and tracking. This is where 2025 diverges from 1933 completely. In 1933, gold was private, physical, hidden. You could bury it in a field and no one would know. But Bitcoin? Bitcoin leaves footprints. Every centralized exchange requires KYC. Every transaction is on a public ledger. Every off-ramp is regulated. Every U.S. exchange reports to the IRS. Bitcoin is decentralized, but Bitcoin ownership in America is not anonymous, and that changes the entire game. The second Roosevelt collected enough gold, he moved to the next phase. The moment the U.S. collects enough Bitcoin, 2025 will move to the next phase too. Phase 3, mandatory acquisition. The decisive moment when optional becomes required. This is the moment confiscation becomes unavoidable. In 1933, it looked like this. You have 30 days to surrender your gold. Failure to comply is a felony. In 2027, it will look like this. You have 30 days to sell your Bitcoin to the Treasury at the official price. The script is identical, only the asset changes. But the penalties? They'll be even harsher this time. Roosevelt threatened 10 years in prison. The modern government can threaten felony tax evasion, anti-money laundering violations, asset forfeiture, financial terrorism statutes, custodial penalties. Because in the digital age, non-compliance can be defined as a national security threat, and they can enforce it far more efficiently because they know exactly how much you own. They know exactly when you bought it. They know exactly where you custodied it. Exchanges are choke points. Banks are choke points. On-chain analytics is the modern equivalent of door-to-door search. Most people will comply, not because they want to, but because fear is a universal language. And the price offered, it won't be market value. It will be an official price. Maybe $50,000, maybe $80,000. The number doesn't matter. What matters is that, just like 1933, the sale will happen before revaluation. And that brings us to the most devastating phase. Phase 4. Revaluation. The phase that erases debt and erases your wealth. This is where the magic trick becomes obvious. In 1934, after acquiring the nation's gold, Roosevelt revalued it from $20.67 to $30 per ounce. That single move instantly wiped out about 40% of the government's debt burden because the dollar collapsed relative to gold. Now imagine the same mechanism applied to Bitcoin. Once the Treasury accumulates, say 1 million BTC, the revaluation begins. The government declares Bitcoin to be worth $500,000 per coin or $1,000 per coin or whatever number balances the national balance sheet. Remember, in 1933, gold's price wasn't based on market forces. It was based on what the debt required. The same logic will apply in 2027. The day after revaluation, the government's balance sheet becomes stronger. The real dollar value of debt collapses, inflation explodes. The dollar loses 70–90% of purchasing power. Real assets skyrocket, wages lag behind, the middle class is destroyed, and everyone who surrendered Bitcoin at the official price will watch its value go 10x or 20x after they've lost ownership forever, just like gold holders in 1933. This is not speculation. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the mathematical conclusion of an unpayable debt crisis. When the numbers no longer add up, governments change the numbers. And every time, The citizens pay the price. The timeline, not a theory, but a sequence. The danger isn't that this will happen someday. The danger is that the sequence has already begun. 2025, accumulation, 2026, crisis and justification, 2027, confiscation and revaluation, 2028. The new normal history always compresses at the end of a debt cycle. In the early stages, the changes are subtle, invisible, technical. Then suddenly, everything accelerates. People in 1933 had no idea they were living through the most significant monetary reset in U.S. history. People in 2025 don't realize it either. Not yet, but the signs are unmistakable to anyone who has studied the pattern. And the next phase is the most important of all. Because in the world that's coming, there will only be two types of people: those who comply and lose almost everything, and those who see the pattern early enough to escape. There's a brutal truth about monetary resets. They don't just reorganize balance sheets, they reorganize societies. When Roosevelt confiscated gold in 1933, he didn't just change a price, he changed the architecture of American wealth for the next half-century. He created a new hierarchy: those who trusted the government and surrendered their assets, and those who quietly stepped aside, protected themselves, and emerged wealthier after the reset. The exact same split will happen in 2025-2028. Only this time, the gap will be far wider. Because financial systems today are digital, traceable, and unforgiving. So the question is no longer, will confiscation happen? That part of the story is already written. The real question is there a path to survive it? To navigate the storm without being pulled into the undertow? Yes, but only if you understand what governments can take, what they cannot take, and where the battle lines are drawn. Let's break them down. What they can confiscate, and will, the moment the crisis narrative becomes strong enough. 1. Crypto held on centralized exchanges. This is the lowest hanging fruit. Coinbase, Kraken, Binance US, Gemini. All of them are wired directly into U.S. regulatory structures. If the Treasury issues a mandatory acquisition order, these platforms will comply instantly. Your account can be frozen, force liquidated, converted into USD, or surrendered directly to federal custody. Most Americans storing their Bitcoin on an exchange are not actually storing Bitcoin. They are storing IOUs, assets the government can interrupt with a single email. This is the modern equivalent of keeping gold in a bank vault in 1933. The asset isn't yours. It belongs to the system, and the system answers to Washington. 2. Bitcoin ETFs. Financially convenient? Yes. A trap? Also yes. Bloomberg loves to tell the public that ETFs are the safe way to invest. What they don't tell you is that ETFs are also the easiest way for the government to seize underlying Bitcoin. All it takes is one court order, one emergency act, one national security directive, and the ETF provider must surrender custody. Shareholders get paid at the official price, far below real value. This is what happened to gold holders in 1933. It will happen again. 3. Anything inside U.S. banking infrastructure. If it touches ACH, SWIFT, FDIC, or a U.S. bank, it can be frozen, blocked, or revalued. In times of emergency, the government doesn't need your permission. It needs justification. And financial stability has always been enough. Confiscation today doesn't require soldiers. It requires software. What they cannot easily confiscate, and what historically preserved wealth while everyone else was wiped out. 1. Self-custodied crypto Bitcoin on a hardware wallet, accessible only with your private keys, is the digital equivalent of burying gold in the backyard. The government may know you purchased it. They may know when. They may estimate how much. But proving you still have it, that is far more complex in court. Digital assets in cold storage sit outside. Exchanges, custodial intermediaries, brokerage records, bank control. This is why self-custody is not just a technological choice, it is a political one. 2. Non-KYC Bitcoin. This is one of the few forms of digital wealth the government cannot map precisely. Peer-to-peer purchases, low-limit ATMs, mining, OTC trades. Private wallets passed hand to hand. A government cannot confiscate what it cannot locate. This is the same principle that allowed many Americans in 1933 to quietly keep their gold coins hidden in walls and barns. The penalties were severe, but the enforcement was limited. And in every confiscation event in modern history, those who had unregistered assets fared best. 3. Assets outside U.S. jurisdiction. The wealthy have always used this strategy. Foreign vaults, foreign companies, foreign custodians. It's not about evading law. It's about spreading risk across legal systems. If the U.S. government targets your domestic holdings, Swiss vaults or Singapore custodians don't automatically comply. In a multipolar world, not every nation follows Washington's commands. And in a global monetary reset, neutrality becomes a commodity. 4. Real assets. Land, housing, productive businesses, resources. These cannot be erased by revaluation. When the dollar collapses, real assets inflate. Rents rise, food prices rise, energy prices rise. Farmland appreciates, commodities surge. These assets live outside database-based confiscation. They can be taxed, yes, but they cannot be deleted with a keystroke. This is why landowners in the 1930s survived deflation and why landowners in the 1970s survived inflation. The underlying principle is simple. Governments can freeze digits, but they cannot freeze soil. The psychology of enforcement, the piece of the puzzle almost nobody understands. In 1933, the penalty for refusing to hand over gold was 10 years in prison, $10,000 fine, $230,000 today. But do you know how many people were prosecuted? Very few. Because confiscation doesn't require mass arrests. It requires mass compliance. Governments rely on fear, not manpower. They rely on citizens assuming everyone else will comply, so I should too. They rely on the psychology of obedience. This will be even more true in 2027. Exchange accounts will be auto-frozen, wallets will be flagged, automated IRS letters will be generated, penalties will sound terrifying. But the government cannot imprison millions. It cannot prosecute millions. It cannot investigate millions. Confiscation succeeds not because the state is strong, but because the population is scared. Those who hid gold in 1933 were not rebels. They were realists, and they emerged decades later with fortunes intact. The end of a monetary order and the beginning of something much harsher. This entire process is not ultimately about Bitcoin. It is not about crypto. It is not even about gold. It is about the end of a debt cycle, the end of the US dollar's uncontested supremacy. Every reserve currency in history has collapsed. The Roman denarius, the Byzantine salatus, the Spanish real, the British pound all collapsed under the same pressure, unpayable debt and military overreach. The US dollar is now facing that same wall. Foreign central banks are dumping treasuries. BRICS nations are building alternatives. Gold accumulation is at a 55-year high globally. The U.S. is bleeding purchasing power domestically and credibility internationally. The government's response is predictable. When a currency fails, states seize hard assets to rebuild the foundation. In 1933, the hard asset was gold. In 2025, it is Bitcoin, gold, and anything outside the inflation machine. This is the largest monetary transition in a century, and it will not be gentle. The final divide, where history splits people into winners and casualties, there will be two groups. One, those who comply. They'll trust the system. They'll keep their assets on exchanges. They'll hold dollars because they believe in stability. They'll surrender their Bitcoin at the official price. They'll watch inflation devour their savings. They'll rebuild from zero. 2, those who prepare, they'll self-custody. They'll diversify across borders. They'll hold real assets and hard assets. They'll navigate quietly. They'll wait for the reset. And when the dust settles, they'll buy distressed assets at pennies on the dollar, just like the few who held gold through 1933. The new financial era will not be kind, but it will favor the informed, the cautious, and the independent. Because in a world where governments can confiscate with a database query, survival belongs to those who stay one step outside the system. History is repeating. The pattern is clear. The timeline is accelerating. And the window to act is closing. Protect yourself now. Before the letter arrives, before the freeze begins, before the revaluation hits, before the panic spreads, before the system resets. Once the confiscation order is signed, there is no undo button. You will either be positioned or erased.